Illinois and the lack of parole and the need for it. And I'm saying parole or discretionary parole as opposed to mandatory supervised release because it's a difference between the two. The difference being, currently there's less than 100 people currently incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections that are being considered for parole that are still serving time for a crime that occurred before 1978, before the state of Illinois abolished the parole system. These people are commonly known as or called C numbers because their prison identification numbers begin with the letter C. In 1978, Illinois passed a law requiring everyone released from prison to serve time on what's known as mandatory supervised release or MSR. Although MSR is not parole, people on MSR are commonly referred to as being on parole because the same infrastructure, parole officers, etc., is used to monitor both those on MSR as well as the remaining individuals that are C numbers that are being released. In reality, however, people on MSR were not granted any discretionary release. In reality, however, people on MSR were not granted any discretionary release before their sentences were completed. Rather, they was completed their entire sentence and whether they was granted good time credits or not. And they are now serving additional years of their sentence on what is known as mandatory supervised release. Meaning that once the court sentences an individual to 30 years, once an individual gets done doing that 30 years, on top of that 30 years, they have to do mandatory supervised release. So it's really unconstitutional in that sense because it's going beyond the time which it was initially sentenced to. In addition to this, Illinois abolished parole for two reasons. First, life without parole was sought as a replacement for the death penalty, but the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court from 1972 to 1976. The handful of people previously sentenced to death by default were resentenced to parole eligibility life sentences. For 7 years, Illinois grappled with the way to replace the death penalty and would permanently remove people from society that they deemed to be irredeemable. The push for this was accompanied by the life means life rhetoric and the demand that Illinois abandon the policy of providing parole eligibility for lifers, and they served out that 11 years and 3 months of incarceration. Then in 1978, legislation was passed that abolished parole, implementing life without parole sentences. By that time, however, the death penalty had already been reinstated. There's mixed feelings when it comes to parole, being that the media is currently confusing the public by saying parole when it's really mandatory supervised release in this state. This is important to understand the difference between the two, because few people who are still released on parole in Illinois to C numbers rarely ever commit crimes. Because like I said, most individuals who are C numbers committed their crimes prior to 1973 or 1976. However, every time someone commits a crime while on MSR, you hear individuals saying that he or she was out on parole, which is not the case in Illinois. What we're looking at is a system that is really used as a term that is being used to cover up another system that is not being used at all. Illinois totally lacks parole completely. There was currently in Illinois what we have, like I said, is the MSR, and MSR is only used as adjunctive to the parole. The benefits of the parole board in Illinois would be that individuals would be able to earn their release based off of demonstrated rehabilitation by way of what Illinois can put in place to assess individuals on a case-by-case basis. Whatever the needs individuals may have to meet, if they meet them needs, then they can be earned their early release through parole. Short of them meeting the needs requirement of the case-by-case basis on each individual, they would not be able to be afforded parole. Currently, the push for parole in Illinois has introduced a parole that was signed in 2019 for juveniles after serving 10, 15, or 20 years. But this only goes in effect in 2029 for those who committed the offense when they was under the age of 21. And for murder, they have to do 20 years before they go to parole. But like I said, this is only for individuals coming in after 2019. So currently, this law has no effect on individuals already incarcerated. For one, we look at the state of Illinois. We see that the laws are currently used to incapacitate too many people to the point where they pose no threat to society any longer. In Illinois courts are refusing to provide fair constitutional sentencing hearings to people that's been incarcerated for lengthy sentences who have been in prison for crimes that occurred when they were juveniles and young adults. Since Illinois abolished the parole in 1978, IJOC budget has ballooned from $52 billion to $1.5 billion, draining state's resources. Illinois Department of Corrections is one of the most overcapacity prison systems in the nation. Parole costs only about $2,000 per person annually, while incarceration costs $38,000 per person annually. Society now has the tools to create a fair and effective parole system that would better serve the community as well as the individuals who are coming within the prison, being that it can be overseen and implemented in a way in which it benefits the individual and allow them to develop the skills necessary to not reoffend once they are released and to serve their needs while they are incarcerated. Everybody that is incarcerated should be afforded opportunities to return to society as a productive citizen. Keep in mind, in the Illinois Constitution, Article 1, Section 11, states that all criminal penalties shall be determined both according to the seriousness of the offense and with the objective of restoring the offender to use of citizenship. By bringing a parole system, it still needs to be worked out through the legislature, but it can be introduced in a way that can better serve the community on both ends, those who are being victimized as well as those who are victimizing, to understand why they are offended and why they can correct their wrongs and be a service, deterrent fact to the community as opposed to just locking this person away.
Wow. What stuck out to me was when you were talking about it costs $32,000 to incarcerate someone, and it costs $2,000 to give them parole, like to have them in the parole system. That is crazy, like when you think about it. And when you multiply all of that funding by everyone that's incarcerated currently, and you think like that money could be used on rehabilitation services, it's crazy how much, it's just crazy to think about that.
I would say, I think being that the money is being used in that way is really a tax on the community. Because once an individual is incarcerated, you think if they are spending $38,000 to incarcerate, then that money should be used to better that individual, because he will be released at some point, as opposed to just using that money to pay off this overtime, unions, food and shelter, etc., as opposed to allowing that person to be in society where he can work and be a contributing member to society and stop taxing the resources of the state with all the responsibilities that come with it, running and keeping them in prison. Oftentimes, like I said, feeding up inmates 50, 60 years old and still are being denied parole for crimes that occurred before 1973, and yet they still languishing in prison, old, in need of health care, etc. And they no longer pose a threat to society.
Wow. It's crazy. Like I read a article a few years ago. I'm not sure if it was in the Chicago Sun-Times or the Chicago Tribune, but they basically kind of did like a map of how people, when they're incarcerated, they're removed from their communities. So everything that they could have contributed to their communities, the community is taken away from the community. And that's, what people don't really think about when they think about these long sentences and things like that, and the lack of rehabilitation, funding dedicated to rehabilitating people as opposed to locking them up. So when you mentioned that made me think about that article that I had came across. So yeah.
I think this is something that Illinois is currently trying to address, in the sense of once individuals are being incarcerated, being taken from their community, and are often held in communities in rural Illinois or rural towns, and we really use to replace the farming industry. And so now they are trying to, after so many years, I forget when this began, but you will be counted on the census of the community where you come from, as opposed to the community where you are currently being housed at. Like
Yes.
here I am being held at Hill Correctional Center in Galesburg. So that whatever amount of individuals currently held in this prison is being added to the Galesburg town census.
Wow.
And so that's money that they are receiving. It's taking that money from the community which we come from, and it's going to this community. So it's like they double dipping on our incarceration.
Wow. 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 It's crazy because it's so many corporations and people that profit off of mass incarceration. Like, you know, Ava DuVernay, she really did an amazing job of addressing it in 13th, you know, how like, you know, how these corporations really profit. And then just to see like, you know, the gerrymandering, I think that you were talking about, and how they, you know, they take, you know, they use the census and they count people in the wrong areas. Like it's crazy, you know. And then we have our, you know, communities that have been, I think the word is divested in or disinvested in. And, you know, our community, the businesses are being closed down. You look around everywhere, the houses are boarded up, and you wonder why. Like it's crazy how all of this is deeply connected.
It's definitely all interrelated. If you would see a person being taken from a family, that's income being taken out of a household from that person working. And so what it may require from that person to sustain himself in prison is also money being taken out of that household to afford him with that thing. Let's say while he's in prison. And then how much of a strain it may put on that family. They may have that family to move out of their house into another house. The children in school from one school to another school. Mothers being deprived when the opportunity children can be broken up, sheltered with other family members, or if not placing DCFS, etc. And then we look at the corporate aspect of it is with the company, with the corporations controlling the phone that we're speaking on, the tablets that we use, the commissary food that we use, the shoes that we wear. And these things are being jacked up on the prices when you're looking at it. Well, it continues to exploit us for the benefit of the corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to see that in Illinois, with the sentences that are being imposed, the truth that was imposed in response to Bill Clinton tough on crime bills, only serve the purpose of locking individuals away. And so now once Illinois says, okay, we're going to use the truth sentence, meaning that whatever sentence you have to serve 85 to 100% of that sentence. So now what Illinois failed to do and remedy that is to modify the sentencing provisions. So before it was murder carry sentence of 20 to 60 years. But once you introduce the truth in sentencing, whatever sentence that you receive is still being used as if you were still doing 50% of that time and it determine the sentence. So you still have individuals doing time, like I said, for a crime that occurred that we have now no longer that person. And we are still languishing in prison or being locked away for a crime like occurred while we use the juveniles and young adults. And what purpose does it serve when we're looking at it is I ask myself, if I get locked up for a crime that occurs as a juvenile, still developing myself, still finding myself, after 20 years you would say, okay, well, I am no longer that person. I am now ready for society. I have committed, I have redeemed myself, took all advantages possible to me, available to me to better myself. Now I'm ready for society. Yet still, the prison is saying, no, you still have to do 20 more years for your sentence. There's no available remedy for us to earn our release early based off of rehabilitation because there's no rehabilitation being offered to us right now in Illinois prisons. We lack education. We lack education. We lack industries. We lack trade groups. And so oftentimes when you come into these programs, they say, well, these programs are for individuals who are about to go home. However, it's so short and few for individuals who are about to go home. It serves no purpose to better them individuals. And more importantly, there's no health care in the system of mental health that prepare an individual who has just spent 20, 25 years in prison to return to society and prepare himself for society.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, that was a really like important points. Like it's really crazy. You know, what's was taken from the communities when individuals are incarcerated and for long and extended periods of time, especially when they are young and still developing. Your mind isn't fully developed as a child or a teenager, and to put those those long sentences on youth is it can be devastating. So
It's definitely devastating because we just look at my situation. Here I am sitting in prison for a sentence of 86 years for a crime that occurred when I was 14 years old. And while I maintain my innocence, I have absolutely nothing to do with this crime at all. Yet, being I have not been able to find redress through the court system, I cannot find it through the prison system, being that we lack the parole. You would think after doing 20, locked up 28 years come December.
You have 1 minute left.
A means of which to afford me the opportunity to earn a release should have been available at some point in time, but it has not been. If we look at it, I have been sentenced to a crime of 86 years, for a sentence of 86 years for a crime that occurred when I was 14 years old. And while I've been incarcerated, I've been constantly maintaining my innocence and been trying to pursue my exoneration through the legal system. It has not been to my avail. But however, being that there has not been available to me the parole system or a way in which I can earn my release through other demonstrated rehabilitation, I have been confined to the prison continuously. After spending 28 years in prison, according to my sentence, I still must serve 20 more years almost without any way in which to earn a release, in spite of how many education programs I have participated in, how many curricular programs I have participated in, without having any major incidents as the last 20 years. Yet still, I must still languish in prison, being that the Illinois prisons lack any way in which for me to earn a release. And so when we're looking at it, this means that I am no longer supposed to threaten society. I have more to offer to society in a prison other than being a number in prison. But yet I must still languish away innocent prisoner, being that Illinois is back a way for me to earn a release. And my sentence served no purpose other than purely punishment.
wow. And what drew me to your case is that it's very similar to my brother's. He was arrested at the age of 16, and I think that I know that this system definitely preys upon young Black youth, especially in the 90s. It definitely preyed upon young Black youth and poor people as well. Like, our families often don't have the resources to fight these cases, whereas if, there's the same type of case in a white neighborhood or a white community with a white family, they may have the resources, the financial resources to hire a good lawyer to fight. But, a lot of times in our community, we don't. So I think that's definitely, something important to point out,
When we look at it, oftentimes we see it, but the wave of the penitentiary changing from being rehabilitation to imprisonment is really when we see the influx of, prior to the drug wars, with Reagan and Bush bringing in then coming in with the super predator, young predator. And so with this fear, everybody ran on the mantra of tough on crime. And while they maintain this a field of being tough on crime, it really deprives our communities of being able to properly defend ourselves from these crimes that they're being led against us, being that we do not have the resources to actually combat the crimes that they are being leveled against us. Then being that we are overly indicted on offenses. And so this is the way in which they are using to persuade individuals into pleading guilty. But we often they would indict you for 15 charges and they say, well, you're facing this excessive sentence, but if you plead guilty, we give you this much reduced sentence. And oftentimes individuals looking at it like I done spent 2 or 3 years fighting this crime, and I haven't been able to get any. Well, why continue to fight when I don't have a chance of winning? So let me go ahead and plead guilty to this. That's an offense just to get out of prison. And again, then you got to deal with this permanent stigma of being a felon, and while you was incarcerated, this gap on your work record, your education history, and not being afforded the opportunity to learn how to return to society as a productive member with marketable skills by which way you can expect to be able to obtain gainful employment. And this is some of the things that we really have to look at is that while we are just sitting in this prison, what can we do to better ourselves and to return to society that we don't try to take advantage of ourselves? I may try to take advantage of the opportunities being made facility, but it really comes down to the resources that I have available to me. And that comes from family and friends. And how much time are they willing to expend and offer me their time and energy and finances when it really should fall to the state to expect to read. Like I said, as the Illinois Constitution have the objective of restoring me to useful citizenship. That isn't the case.